So before I get into anything else, the first thing I want to talk about is, well, what is a lettering artist? Because there's a lot of terms that get thrown around that relate to type, but they often get mixed up and used a bit interchangeably. So for example, these are probably the most common terms that get used when referring to type. So there's calligraphy, lettering, type design, typography. So just to clarify some of the differences before we start with some top line definitions. So calligraphy is essentially writing, lettering is drawing, type design for the most part is designing typefaces, and typography, broadly speaking, is the arrangement of type in some kind of layout. So what I do specifically is draw letter forms. That's mostly what my work comprises of. But I do also try and do a little bit of calligraphy as well, because I think all good lettering artists should. And the reason for that is to understand something called pen influence, which is something I'm going to talk about a little more later on. So just to give you some quick examples of my work. So I work with both design agencies and direct clients, and I make custom letterings for all different kinds of applications. So these, what you can see here, these are for some packaging projects. And all of these, apart from the top right, are for what you call fast-moving consumer goods brands. So these are cases where design agencies approach me to create a custom word mark or logo type. And brands want something custom because they want to stand apart in their own marketplace. So a bespoke logo type that's unique and most importantly ownable is something that they're after. So these are all drawn completely from scratch. There's no typefaces used at all here. So these are the logo types shown in isolation, and these are what they look like when the design agencies applied them onto the packaging. So sometimes packaging projects will need custom lettering created not as the actual main brand mark, but for the secondary messaging on the packs. So this is an example of that for the KY brand. So again, this is all completely custom lettering drawn from scratch. No typefaces were harmed during the making of these. And again, this is how it looked when they were applied to the packs. So I also do quite a lot of poster work for various clients and some personal projects in various lettering styles. And just by the way here, in case you're wondering, the spelling mistake in the middle poster, it's actually intentional. This is designed for a book cover. I do quite a lot of book covers, but I'm not going to talk through all of these projects individually. I just want to give you a quick overview, and then we'll come back to one or two projects later on and look at them in more depth. I also do quite a lot of illustrative lettering. So these are not made in 3D software. This is just Illustrator and Photoshop. I also like to make experimental pieces too, trying to create things that I've not really seen before. I do a lot of script work. And these are some decorative pieces. So I do all manner of letter forms, and I like to make a point in my work of always trying new things. That way, the more things that I try, the more that I learn, and then the more possibilities I have in my sort of bag of tricks, you know, to tackle any kind of client brief that comes in. And you can call this style or aesthetics, and it is those things, but for me, really, it's about communication and being able to communicate in different ways through a visual expression and just using letter forms. So to convey an idea or a mood or a feeling or a place. So that's just a quick overview of some of my work. And now let's get into the topic for the conference, which is, of course, making your mark. So the more I thought about this, the more I thought, actually, it's such a really good theme for a conference, because everything that we do as creative people kind of comes down to making a mark in some way. So for me, it's about career, discovering your thing, you know, something that you love, that you want to do. It's about ambition, having goals and aspirations. It's about inspiration, you know, the things that we see that others have done that then inspire us into action. And it's also about legacy as well. What mark can you leave behind, big or small, to inspire others in the future. So I'm going to talk about all of these things today, but obviously in the context of my own experience. And I've got a few recommendations throughout for books and other things. But I know these are all being recorded, so you can look at them afterwards as well. Or you could take screenshots if you like. So I'm going to start by jumping straight in with probably the biggest source of inspiration for me in my life and my career. And that's my dad, Tony Forster. So first of all, I can't possibly do a talk about lettering and type without first talking about my dad and his work. And I think this will give some context to what's coming later on. So he was a pretty well-known lettering artist.
You're muted.
Sorry, I don't know whether, Dan, I think you've lost your mic.
There you go.
Is that wasn't for the whole thing, was it?
No, you just started talking about your dad.
All right, cool. I don't know what happened there. Sorry about that. So, yeah, my dad, he was a pretty well-known lettering artist internationally, and he'd won all these awards, and he was featured in lots of international publications over the years. And I could talk about his work all day, but really just to give you a quick snapshot, to give you a flavour of his work. And he was a master craftsman, so everything he did, he put his heart and soul into it. And one thing I always liked about his approach was, no matter who he was working for, whether it was a big multinational client or just his local butcher, he'd always put the same thought and care and attention into all his projects. And one thing that I learned from that, and I guess this is the first tip for you really, is that every project is what you make of it. So it doesn't matter who the client is. If you put the effort in to create a great idea, you can make amazing award-winning work. So everything my dad did was by hand. There wasn't a computer in sight. And these are just some pen and ink sketches or drawings. And the white is gouache, which is what he used to retouch out any mistakes. And he had some high praise from some renowned industry professionals as well. So in 2011, he was described by Tony Despigna in Graphic magazine as the Herb Llewellyn of England. And I know that he would have been blown away to read this. So I was really lucky to grow up with a creative dad. And this is me in his studio in about 1978. So I would have been 3. And the room was just full of design and artworks and all metal signs. And I spent a lot of time in his studio watching him work or rummaging through his book collection. And there was art and design. It was everywhere. It was all over the house as well. So it was amazing for me to grow up around all of this. And I guess in some ways it was kind of inevitable that I'd get into doing something creative myself. But there was one particular thing that my dad taught me during my college years that stayed with me ever since. And looking back at this, and especially considering what I do now, it's probably one of the most important lessons that I was ever taught. So for context, I was studying graphic design at the time. I was about 17 or 18, and I was interested in type and lettering for sure. But at the time, I was more interested in the broader field of graphic design. So it was over one summer holidays, and I was in between college courses, and my dad had decided that in order to get me ready for college, he was going to give me some design projects to do. And I was pretty excited about this because at the time I was just learning to use one of these, and I was really keen to, learn and create some work on it. But then my heart sank when he gave me the first project, which was this. So basically I had to hand draw a lowercase Helvetica A over and over until it was perfect. So initially I was thinking, oh, what the hell? This is just, it's going to be so boring. And I had to trace them at first, but the point was that they had to be perfect. So any slip of the pen or wobbly lines, and I'd have to start right over again. So I reluctantly got on with it, and I started drawing A after A after A after A. And then I thought when I'd done a good one, I'd go and show him, and he'd look at it and he'd go, "Nah, there's a wonky line here. That's no good. Do another. Oh, no, that's no good. Try again." And this went on for a few days, and obviously I did get better as I went along. But by the end, I think I'd drawn about 50 A's. And what I didn't realize at the time was that I was learning some vital foundational skills about type and letters. And then afterwards, and this was the whole point of the lesson, he sat me down and he said, "You'll never learn anything about the shape and proportions or beauty of letter forms by just pressing a key on a keyboard." So this has always stayed with me, and it's drummed into me the importance of drawing letters by hand and not getting too sucked in too much by computers. And it was only by going through this process that I really began to see and understand and pay attention to how letters were constructed. So here's the first bit of advice I've got for you. Learn to draw letters, and of course for the reasons I've just mentioned, but also as graphic designers, if you can draw type, then the possibilities for creative solutions that you come up with, they're going to extend far beyond the limits of your font menu. In fact, it's actually a great idea to get away from your font menu. So in terms of learning about lettering and drawing different lettering styles, the biggest tip I can give you is to learn about how different pens or writing implements will make different kinds of marks. So this is called pen influence. And I can't stress enough how important it is to understand this, because all type is derived ultimately from writing. So even typefaces, and the thicks and the thins in all of the letter forms, they are where they are because of how a pen first made a mark. Now, if anyone's got an iPad and has been playing with the various brushes in Procreate, my advice would be to put it away. And the iPad is great. I use one and I'm a huge advocate for it. But for learning why letter shapes are the way that they are, you need an actual pen. And it's all to do with the nibs. So here's a quick example of why that is. So this is a broad nib pen. So if you look at how he's turning the angle of the pen and then the resulting mark that this leaves, so this is why swells appear in the places that they do within the letter forms. It's all down to the pen. So this guy's a calligrapher, but it's super important even as a lettering artist to have an understanding of calligraphy and how a pen works. Again there, so look at how the angle change produces the kind of swell that it does. So I don't care what anyone says, you still can't simulate this on an iPad. So, and once you understand pen influence and you have some experience of knowing what marks different kinds of pens will make, you're going to be far better equipped as a lettering artist to draw letters. So these are two books that I'd recommend if you wanted to get into lettering, and both of them are fantastic and they cover all aspects of lettering from drawing and sketching right through to creating the digital vectors. So at this point, obviously I've talked about my dad, and then given what I do, I know it's probably easy to think, oh, this is a like father, like son story. Both of them are lettering artists, but it's not really that straightforward. And the fact is that I actually didn't figure out that lettering was what I really wanted to do until I was in my mid-30s. But early on, type and lettering, it seemed like some kind of dark art to me. I tried calligraphy as a teenager, but after spending just a few days on it, I felt a little bit like this. So I got so frustrated that I couldn't make consistent letters that I just gave up straight away, pretty much. But also I think subconsciously I thought, well, this is what my dad does. I want to do something else. So I went off to pursue graphic design instead. But how I came back to actually discovering letters again, it was actually really unexpected. So in 2008, my dad passed away, and of course we were all devastated. But it was shortly after that there was another key moment of inspiration for me, and it changed absolutely everything. So this is a picture from a bit earlier on. This is in 2004, but this is me and my dad in his studio. Now, of course, he was incredible at making his work, but as you can see from this picture, he wasn't very good at organizing it. The room was just completely and utterly overflowing with work, and you had to tread an incredibly careful path to get around to his desk. So he passed away in 2008, and with me being the only other creative in the family, I was of course tasked with clearing it all out. And it's a bit of a long story, but it took me the best part of 8 years to go from what you can see here to this, which is literally my dad's life's work in boxes. But it was during this process of clearing it all up that I uncovered so much incredible work, and most of it I'd never seen before. I was just so blown away with what I was finding that it inspired me to pick up a pen again and start drawing type. But this time I stuck at it. So this is some of my very early lettering work. And over time, I started sharing some of this online. And then over a bit more time, I eventually picked up some commercial client projects. And then I slowly transitioned to becoming a full-time lettering artist. And you know when you found the thing that you want to do because you can't stop doing it? So this is a piece that I made a few years ago, reflecting on that sentiment. So it's actually funny how things work out. I'd spent at least 15 years dipping my toe into every aspect of design and branding and not really feeling that fulfilled. But it turned out that my ideal discipline, it had been staring me in the face my whole life. So there's a couple of lessons here. Firstly, don't compare yourself to others. I'd made this fatal mistake early on of comparing myself to my dad, and I'd just given up instantly, which is ridiculous when you think about it, because he'd been doing calligraphy for decades at that point, and I'd just been doing it for a few days. The next thing is, it's okay not to have everything figured out from day one. And this can actually be a good thing because it will lead you to trying out different things. And with me now being a lettering artist, but having worked as a graphic designer for all those years beforehand, now when I get a lettering brief from a design agency, I have the advantage of being able to think like a designer. So I can see where they're coming from a lot of the time. And that's a huge advantage. But if I'd have gone straight into lettering from the start, then I wouldn't have had that. So if anyone's a little bit unsure about the direction that you're going in, this is a brilliant book and it talks about some of those things. So one thing that's always fascinated me about type and lettering, and it's something that I love, and it's the possibilities of the forms and the styles of letters and the ideas that you can convey through them. It's literally endless. And this is a quote of my dad's from an interview that he once did. It says, "It's always fascinated me that we only have 26 letters, but arranged in the right order, they can make you laugh or cry, make you happy or sad, angry or elated." And these are some examples of his expressive and playful lettering. And these are great examples of how just clever little adjustments or visual treatments can add a whole other layer of communication. They convey something extra beyond just the written meaning of the word. And I think my favorite out of these is just the simplicity of the logo on the bottom right. So this was created for a chap called Eric Boydell, and he was a carpenter. So here's an example of using humor. Now, my dad, those of you who know my dad, he was a bit of a character and he liked a good laugh. So this was a poster that he made as a present for his dentist. And if you can't read some of the type, it says, "Eat sweets and support your local dentist," which I think is just brilliant. So there's this other side to creative lettering that's always fascinated me, and that is being able to evoke a mood or a feeling through the form or the visual execution. This is a logo for a company who make dancing shoes. And here the ampersand is literally dancing. It's full of life and movement. This is a really clever visual interpretation of one of Donald Trump's tweets, and this is by David Carson. So it's such a simple visual execution, but suddenly it changes the whole meaning, or it can suggest something else entirely. This one has real passion and energy and feeling, and this is where lettering gets really interesting for me, when it can literally stir some kind of emotion or convey feelings or even make you feel something. And just to demonstrate the difference, so here one says hello, but then the other one says hello, but in a particular way, loudly, with life and enthusiasm and purpose. So as designers, we can call upon these visual tricks, and it's our job to help deliver messages, but we can deliver them in a certain way with subtlety and nuance to steer a piece of communication in a particular direction. And that's a really powerful thing. So I've always been fascinated by this, and I often try and inject some of this mood or feeling or a visual idea into my own lettering work. For instance, how might you express love visually? Well, something we could all do with right now is a hug. If you could wave a magic wand using type, what would that look like? Or how might you create the atmosphere of a moody late night jazz bar? This is a poster I made a while ago. I love coffee. I particularly love the aroma and the smell of coffee, which is what inspired me to make this. Travel's always been inspiring for me. I've always found it interesting to try and capture the essence or the feeling of a place. If you go somewhere and you look around, every place has its own culture and distinct visual identity. So what visual cues can be used to capture it? So I'm fascinated by how it might be possible to reflect the feeling of the place through lettering and type alone. And I always try and make some type wherever I go. So the possibilities for being creative and expressive with lettering and type, it's literally infinite. So the next tip is make the kind of work that you want to do and then share it online and in your portfolio. And the more you do this, the more chance you're going to have of getting that kind of work. So for instance, if you don't want to do web design, then don't put that web project in your portfolio. And I know it seems obvious, but I see young designers doing this all the time. If you don't have enough of the kind of work that you want in your portfolio, then make some hypothetical projects or some personal projects and put them in your portfolio. So here's an example. So I love to experiment and try new things with lettering. So I'm always looking for opportunities to do that. And a great place is during the 36 Days of Type challenge. And if you haven't heard of this, this is an event that takes place on Instagram every year, whereby you create a single letter every day for 36 days. So it's A to Z and then 0 to 9, and that equals 36 days. And it's pretty challenging, but it's a brilliant exercise, and it usually happens in March, so it'll be coming up soon. So it's worth looking out for and getting involved in it if you can. So these are my letters that from when I took part in 2018, and this is the rest of the set. But going back to making the kind of work that you want to do, this is the kind of thing that I'd happily do all day long if somebody paid me. I love experimenting. Well, as a result of doing this, I actually had a new client come along who'd seen my set of letters and commissioned me to create this experimental letter queue for a magazine that they were designing. So this was the opening spread for a magazine in the US. So make the kind of work that you want to do. The next tip, once you've made the work that you want to do, share it, because you never know what might happen. And here's an example of that. So the following year, when 36 Days of Type came around, I was a bit disappointed because I was too busy to actually take part. So I just drew this A. And then I was sort of in two minds whether I should post it, because I was thinking, is it a bit of a cop-out just to do the A and not the other 35 days? And also it was just a sketch and it's a little bit rough around the edges. But in the end, I just thought, oh, why not? I'll just share it anyway. And I'm glad that I did, because about a month later, I got this email. So this was from Jessica Walsh of Sagmeister and Walsh fame. And it just said, "Hi there, are you interested in a type commission?" So when I read this was pretty much my reaction. So I was totally pinching myself. So I emailed straight back and said, "Yes, of course." And then I got another email and they said, "Right, great. Sagmeister and Walsh, they're rebranding. The new identity is going to be based around lots of different ampersands." And as a reference, they'd sent back my A to me, the one that I almost didn't post. And they said, "We love this A. Can you make some ampersands that look like this? Oh, and do as many as you can." So they had to be quirky and unusual and unique, but still recognizable as ampersands. So long story short, over the next 2 to 3 weeks, I drew over 250 oddball ampersands and then sent them off. And then I got an email back. Jessica said, "That's great. Thanks so much. We love them." And then they paid the bill. And then I didn't hear anything until about 2 months later. And then they announced that Stefan Sagmeister and Jessica Walsh had actually parted company, and that this new company, And Walsh, was born. And lo and behold, my ampersands were all over it. So this put a massive smile on my face, as you can imagine. So if I hadn't shared that A on 36 Days of Type, this project would have never come my way. So share your work. And here's a great book on that subject. So the next tip, when it comes to lettering work, you're never going to get there with your first try. You need to iterate, iterate, iterate. And here's a lettering piece I made a few years ago, inspired by a trip to Lisbon. And here's how many pencil drawings it took me just to get to the composition that I was happy with. Then after this, even, there were several more revisions that I made, first on the iPad and then later at the vector stage. And I've had students ask me in the past, and they'll say, "Oh, I'm struggling with a piece of lettering that I'm doing." And I'll say, "Well, how many versions have you done?" And they might say, "Oh, I've done 2 or 3. And so my response to that is that that's nowhere near enough. I'm lucky if I get there in 5. So keep drawing and keep redrawing. So this is an example of one of my processes. So this is a sketch that I made in Procreate on the iPad. And this is a time lapse of about 10 hours work, but it's shown in about 30 seconds. These 10 hours were actually spread out over several weeks, where I kept going back and refining over and over until I finally got to a place where I was happy with it. And that's another tip, really. If you're struggling with something, walk away from it for a little while or come back to it the next day, and I'll guarantee that you'll see something new that you didn't see before that you want to correct. And that's because you'll have fresh eyes. So this was the final sketch for that. So another piece of advice, when it comes to lettering and type, this is a little phrase that I've started using in recent years. The eye is mightier than the math. So what do I mean by this? Well, type is absolutely full of optical illusions. And if you try and rely on geometry, you're not going to get very far. Now, this could be a huge section. It could take up an entire talk, and we don't have time for that today. But just to show you one example, so this was the logotype that I designed for Flora. And on the face of it, it looks pretty simple, but it was actually incredibly challenging and really difficult to make. And it was mostly due to the fact that it had to work on a smiling curve, which was the requirement of the brief. So for starters, it was a nightmare to adjust the spacing. If I wanted to do that, then I had to redraw all the characters at new angles. And the blue dotted line here, that's the safe area on the pack. And so again, on the face of it, the logo, it looks pretty centered, right? Well, not really. In actual fact, from a symmetrical point of view, it's all over the place. The O, even though it's in the middle character, it's not centered at all. And then if you look at the bottom of the F versus the bottom right of the A, those two are way off being positioned symmetrically with each other. The next thing I tried was some vertical guidelines based on the baseline curve, but even this didn't help. And when I followed this, the whole thing looked completely wrong. So basically, the entire mark had to be drawn optically, just so that when it was unpacked, it looked balanced and centered. So this was the final pack. And I was kind of relieved when it was done. So I see people all the time drawing letters and trying to stay within what they think is the safety of geometry. But trust me, geometry is not your friend. Type is anything but geometric. So try and learn to trust your eyes. And when it comes to inspiration, I think it's important to look outside of your own discipline. So if you're a graphic designer and you only look at graphic design for inspiration, you're really going to limit yourself. And creativity can, of course, come in any form. So here's some examples of marks that others have made in different fields that have really fired my imagination. And something that's always captured my attention is design on a grand scale. So this is the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, Gaudi's masterpiece. And in terms of having a ridiculously audacious goal, it doesn't get much crazier than this. Now, if you don't know about this building, it's not finished, and Gaudi passed away in 1926 when the church was only 25% complete. And now, nearly 100 years later, it's still not done. And some people think it's an ugly building, and I can sort of see where they're coming from. But when I first went inside, I was absolutely blown away. And I've seen a lot of grand cathedrals, but nothing like this. This is the ceiling. It's just an utterly unique and mind-blowing piece of art. And if you go along at the right time of day, then you'll see this. So this is just natural light shining through multicolored stained glass windows. And it makes this wonderful interplay of man-made design and nature. This is the Alhambra in Granada in Spain, and this is the central area, which is called the Court of Lions. So every inch of the building is covered in these spectacular and intricate carvings, and it boggles the mind, how long must it have taken them to create it? This is the temple at Angkor Thom in Cambodia. And again, just incredible levels of detail on a truly vast scale. And I used to think, why do we not design and build things on this scale anymore with this level of care and craftsmanship? And I know these days budgets are a big factor, and there's also challenges like planning consent. But it turns out people are still dreaming up amazing things and fighting to make them a reality. So this is the Golden Bridge near Da Nang in Vietnam. And the architect's concept was that these are giant hands of the gods which are pulling this strip of gold out of the land and creating this walkway in the sky. I think it's amazing. These are the gardens in the bay in Singapore. And again, such a beautiful out of this world design on a truly vast scale. These are some sculptures by an artist called Chad Knight. Now, these are not real yet, but I wish that they were. So what is it about all these things that I find fascinating? And I think with all of them, it's the scale of the ambition that I love. I mean, when you talk about making a mark, these are things that really stand out and make a statement. But then I ask, well, what can I do as a lettering artist? Is there any inspiration I can take from these examples that I could perhaps bring to my own work? Well, yeah, absolutely. I've always wanted to create something that has a sense of scale and ambition like these, or is maybe perhaps insanely detailed. And it made me wonder, is anybody out there actually doing this kind of thing with letters and type? So I looked into it, and yeah, it turns out there are. So here's one example you might know. This is the Comedy Carpet in Blackpool. And what a brilliant idea and tribute, really, to celebrate all those comedians by making this permanent mark in the landscape. And it's sort of a mark in history too, really, if you think about it, of memories and of people and of things that have happened in this place. I love it. This is a piece by Stefan Sagmeister, which was made at a conference in Amsterdam where the theme was urban play. And it says, "Obsessions make my life worse and my work better. And it was built from 300,000 coins, and it took 150 volunteers 8 days to make it. This is a piece by the calligrapher Seb Lester, and the level of detail and craftsmanship here, it just absolutely blows me away, because I know this is not easy to do, and I find this kind of thing quite awe-inspiring. So I always wanted to try and do something that had a really high level of grandeur and detail, and roughly 2 years ago I had my first chance. So I was contacted by an agency in New York called Thought Matter, and they'd seen some of my work and they were looking for a lettering artist to try and bring their company values to life in some way to inspire their staff. So it was an internal project. But the brief was quite open as to how they would do this. And at first they'd suggested maybe doing a set of postcards. So their values all fell under this overarching idea of work worth doing. And it was full of really aspirational sentiments like turn heads, raise bars, dream big, deliver magic. So it was all this really positive and energizing stuff. And I suggested to the client that, well, instead of a set of postcards, which, let's face it, they're probably going to get lost on people's desks, maybe instead they should make a massive poster on their studio wall. And it obviously have a lot more permanence than the postcards, and it could be this huge, beautiful work of art with great detail and weight and gravitas, and it could truly live up to their concept of work worth doing. It could be almost like the 13 commandments hanging on the wall. And they said, yes, fantastic, go for it. So this was probably one of the hardest and most challenging projects I've ever worked on. And these are some of the stages that it went through. And it took me over 30 days of work, which was spread out over 3 months, because the client, they didn't have the budget for what it would actually take me to do this. But I saw this as an opportunity that I didn't want to miss. So I put it to them that if they were prepared to wait, then I'd be prepared to make them the best piece of lettering that I'd ever created. But obviously I'd have to work on it in between other better paying jobs and projects. So it was going to take me a while. But they were fine with that. So I got on with it. But it was really hard. And there were times early on when I got stuck with a composition, and then later on the client rejected the style that I created for the secondary type, which was the scripts. So I had to redo all of that, and that was a job in itself. And then on top of all that, I had to fit it in and around all these other projects I was doing. So I had quite a lot of late nights, and I was pretty exhausted. But it paid off, and this was the final poster, and I was incredibly proud of the end result, and I'm delighted to say that it went on to win a Communication Arts Award for typography. So these are some of the details. And it was shortly after this that a friend asked me, he said, why put yourself through the pain of making something like this, of making something like so detailed and so intricate, to put in all of those hours of work when you're only getting paid for a fraction of that? And I think the answer is that I wanted to try and create something that, well, firstly, that I hadn't seen before, but I also wanted to try, if I could, to create a little bit of that awe and that wonder that I'd seen in these inspirational pieces of architecture and sculptures, and hopefully try to maybe stop people in their tracks, or to maybe make them think differently about something, or maybe even to inspire them into action to push harder for their own goals in their lives or their own fields of work. And I guess also it's about connecting people. And I think whether it inspires 1,000 people or just one person, I think that it's a worthy pursuit. And on all of this, it reminds me of something I once read by Stefan Sagmeister. Is it possible to touch somebody's heart with design? And this is a question that he posed in his book, Made You Look, back in 1997. And I think it's a fascinating idea. And I think about this a lot. I thought about it over the years a lot. Or put another way by the designer Ryan Hughes, what I'm trying to produce is the visual equivalent of a chord change that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. And I know where they're both coming from when they say these things, because you'll know when you see or you hear or you experience something that blows you away. It can literally move you to feel something, and it can have a real tangible effect on you. So I think the ultimate goal is to try and create the design equivalent of something like this. Now, I'm not really a big fan of Pavarotti particularly, but whenever I see and I hear this, it always has an effect on me. So I think whatever it is that you want to do in order to make our best marks, firstly, and perhaps most importantly, keep an open mind and let yourself be inspired or even changed by something new. And it could be anything, because it could really change your perspective and then lead you on to new and different possibilities in your own field of work. Then next, set yourself some goals. What do you want to say and how do you want to say it? Try something new and push your limits. And finally, just get on with it and do everything you can to try and make it happen. So I think that would be the best advice I could give to anybody who's wanting to get out there and make their own mark. So that's my talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
I'm not sure how long that went on.
No, that was brilliant. That was incredible.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it's
So-
really good, Dan. Thanks.
Cool.
Before we move to Jim, do we have any questions that anybody'd like to ask at this point?
We're going to do questions at the end.
Or should we? Do you want to do questions after
Yeah.
Jim?
You reckon?
Yeah,
Yeah, can do.
and just do a. Okay, we'll do that then. So hang fire on questions for now.
Yeah.
I think everybody's blown away by that, Dan.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Fantastic amount of work. It's amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I've got to follow that.
Well, I was going to say, can we cancel Jim and just listen to Dan for a bit longer?
Yeah, all right. That's fine.
That's it. There's no more. Everything I've done. Yeah, I hope that came across okay. It's kind of weird standing in your own house with nobody there, just staring at the monitor. So
It was brilliant.
No, it came across.
Dan, you're the new visual Pavarotti then.
hey, I don't want to compare myself to people like Pavarotti. I mean, it's a whole other different thing, but I guess it's the principle of what he does and the effect that it can have on you. And I'm always quite interested in how can you do something like that in the field of design or lettering. So
Okay, should I put my screen up?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know really what to say really because I can't follow that. Well, I'll give it my best.
You'll be fine, Jim. Does Jim need an introduction? Or?
Oh yeah, sorry.
I think most people probably know Type Matters, or
Yeah.
they should do by now, on the graphic design course anyways. We keep mentioning it often enough. So we thought we'd bring you in, Jim, to finally round off.
Right. Well, firstly, can I just thank everyone at Preston for asking me? It's great to be involved and obviously to come back to Preston. So, thanks very much for that. I thought really, for me, what I wanted to do was really to try and take my own view on this idea of making your mark. And really, the way I've looked at it is the idea of landmarks in my career that have had an effect on my work, on my practice, the people I've met and the work that I've looked at and has inspired me. So obviously I'm a graphic designer. I studied at Preston, and I suppose in a way Preston was my first landmark. Okay, so that's me on the right, round about 1980 as a kind of a student at Preston. And thoroughly enjoyable it was. I was taught by Ben and Alan and George. So I always consider myself very fortunate that I went to Preston and studied at Preston, because it was absolutely right for me. Because I was, even at that time, I was starting to develop an interest in letter forms. And, you know, I was never in Dan's league, but I used to enjoy, for example, drawing a typeface called Broadway script and stuff like that. So I was kind of being, you know, drawn into it. What really inspired me at first was I was studying for A-level tech drawing, and I was absolutely hopeless. I enjoyed the drawing bit. I just didn't enjoy the mathematics of it. But the teacher at the school, he ran a little print department. He had a little letterpress print department in the school, and he used to produce tickets, dance tickets and stuff like that. And I'd quite often see this stuff on his desk, and that I actually found that more inspiring and more interesting than designing cogs and gears. So as you can imagine, I really kind of didn't do very well at my A-level tech drawing, but that's kind of another story. So from Preston, I literally went from Ribbleton Avenue to Knightsbridge in London, and I went to work with a lady called Maggie Lewis, who at the time really was one of the advertising industry's foremost typographers. She had, you know, an incredible reputation. She was really admired and respected, and she had this awesome reputation. And what was funny, in the first couple of years I worked in London, I worked under Maggie. She had this fearsome reputation, but she was a massive softie. And she used to make me apple crumbles. She used to bring me apple crumbles into work. And so you can kind of imagine the, you know, the kind of the joke that kind of created about being Maggie's little boy and everything. But, you know, I was very fortunate. I literally left Preston on the Friday and started work on the Monday. So, you know, it was, you know, it was Preston had contributed so much to me getting that first job and going to work with someone of Maggie's stature. So what I want to do, kind of just first of all, guys, is to show you some work that's inspired me. And one of the things that I love about type isn't just the craft of typography, but it's how designers use type as a vehicle for ideas, how designers embed ideas in typography. And that has always kind of really inspired me as well. So a couple of the examples I'm showing you here now, I think what's really important to remember about this is that none of this was done with a computer, okay? What it really required was the will and determination of the designer to realize their idea. And however they did that, I'm not sure, you know, how AutoStorch did this. Quite often at this time, designers were also photographers or illustrators. So I kind of guess he used a photographic technique, but that really lovely, simple idea, the way that the type forms the mattress, you know, it's just a really lovely, lovely idea. And it has that other side to type, that side of type where you can use it for ideas, where designers and creatives embed ideas in typography. This was a piece by Bradbury Thompson, and I don't suppose you could describe it as immediately a beautiful piece of type. What's really good about this piece of type is the way you read it. Okay, the way the type is set, that it makes you read it in a way that you have to turn the page round. So with the positioning of the greyhounds, it kind of visually mimics the greyhounds running round a track. It's so clever and so simple and so beautiful. And it's about the way the type is read, not necessarily about just the type as a beautiful piece of setting. It really makes you think about that other side of typography. Okay, so this is a really lovely piece by a designer in America called DC Stipp, and it was a graduation poster. And why I like this is it's not just the craft, but it's the execution. So obviously you can see the mortarboard and you can see the tassel, and the tassel is made up of the names of the graduating students of that year. But what I particularly like about it is that he doesn't try to make the tassel look perfect. He tries to mimic that idea of the strands coming away, that it's, you know, it's not that these tassels aren't perfect and stuff. But why it's special is because he uses type to convey that very simple premise that type can have an idea in it in the same way that a photograph or an illustration can have. Okay. So you can't talk about ideas in typography and not talk about Herb Luebelin. If there was one piece of work in the history of graphics that I wished I kind of had in my portfolio, it would be this very simple connection that Luebelin made about the counter of the O, that the counter of the O visually connects with a woman's womb. And then obviously the drawing of the ampersand, so that, you know, it has like a fetal quality to it. This, as Dan has kind of touched on, you know, that Fozzie was very much, you know, our Herb Luebelin, and Herb Luebelin worked with a lettering designer for this. I think it was called Alan Pekalik, but none of this, you know, was actually done on a computer. It was all done by hand, all drawn by hand. It's about that hand and eye combination. Okay. Okay, and I can't kind of give a talk when we've talked so much about Fozzie, and this was a really nice mark Fozzie did for the Dyslexia Association of Bolton. From what I remember from conversations with Fozzie, I don't think this ever ran. I don't think it was ever used. Perhaps Dan might be able to confirm that.
That's correct, Jim.
Yeah, all right,
Yeah.
great.
They said the last thing that they needed was a dyslexic designer.
Well, your dad was a bit more animated about it. What he said to me was that they didn't need a fucking designer. But we were having a beer at the time, Dan, so I think, yeah. Okay, so, I mean, just, you know, guys, just a really lovely idea, really simple, visually conveys, you know, what Dan was talking about, ideas, you know, in letter forms, that they set tone, they convey ideas. And, you know, this for me was inspiring when I first saw it, as a student. It's been inspiring for me throughout my career, and still today, you know, I look on this together with Herb Luebelin's mother and child logo as just really wonderful pieces of typography. Okay. So guys, after a couple of years with Maggie, I then moved to an advertising agency called CDP, which was better known as Collett Dickinson Pierce. And Collett Dickinson Pierce is probably one of the most important British creative advertising agencies. It really put creative thinking on the map in the UK. So I'm just going to pull out of this a minute because I'm having problems playing videos at my end. And I think Ted is going to play it for me. So
I'm here.
Are you ready, Ted?
I'm ready. My moment.
Happiness is a cigar called Hamlet, the mild cigar.
Thanks, Ted. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
So I'll share my screen again. So guys, I had absolutely nothing to do with that commercial, okay? Really, the reason I wanted to show it to you was the work of CDP. And if there are any of your advertising students listening into this, they really need to look at the work of CDP. You know, they produce so many really famous work, the famous, work for Benson & Hedges cigarettes, Heineken refreshes the parts other beers cannot reach. Really, really, very important British creative advertising agency. So I've kind of mentioned I had nothing to do with that, but what I did do there was work as a typographer. So this is kind of typical of the advertising work that I did. So how this would work, I would work very closely with the art director. The art director would do a scribble, and I would pull all the assets together and make it work. And I think the important thing to remember when you look about this stuff, there's two things. For any of the ad students, it's not really something that you see much of these days, which is an ad, a long copy ad, an ad that actually has a narrative. And personally, it's something particularly in press that I think that you could look at kind of maybe returning to in some way, actually telling a story in the ads. The other thing to remember about this kind of work was, this was work I was doing in the 1980s, and computers didn't exist. Okay, none of this was done on a computer. This used a photo setting, a process called photo setting, where type was exposed onto photographic film and photographic paper. So it was essentially an analog system. But I think kind of what's important to point out about this is that, we have such freedoms today. We can change point size, we can change typeface at will. When I was working in advertising, you couldn't do that, okay? This literally had to be worked out line by line. So when you look at all them images and you look at all the complex run rounds, how the type follows, the shape of the image, that all literally had to be worked out line by line. And obviously it had to fall exactly where it did to allow the Army officer logo to appear. And this would have been a full page ad in something like the FT or one of the big, broadsheet newspapers. And again, sadly, it's not really kind of something that you know, we see much of these days, but really fundamental for me, you know, to you know, to get involved with, because you know, accuracy was fundamental to this. You know, you couldn't just change typeface, change point size at will. You had to be 100% accurate, you know, in everything that you did. Okay. So this, I thought I'd show you this, guys, because this is a font. Okay. Historically, there is a difference between a font and a typeface. Okay. So that if you think of the font as the hardware of a typeface, so basically, if you also think of it like as a piece of a vinyl record, whereby you play a record and you hear the music, okay, and that in many ways is similar to a font and a typeface. So this is a photo setting font for the typeface Gill Sans Light, and it's about the size of a woman's compact mirror, and you can, you know, from this tiny little glass grid, you could set type 700 points, a foot high, whatever, and it would be absolutely perfect. You know, I remember when you know, when Macs were starting to come out, and I was working on a book project, and I wanted to blow these monotype Baskerville letters up to like a foot high. And when I got the bromides back, when I got the PMTs back, the cut of the face was absolutely appalling. You know, where you had junctions where, for example, the serif came into contact with the stem, it was all over the show. It was absolutely appalling. And it was actually Dan's dad, Fozzie, who rescued it for me. I asked Fozzie to retouch it all for me and, you know, really make the letters perfect. And I was so enraged about this that I actually wrote to the creative director of Monotype and said how, you know, that I'd been trained by some of the best people in advertising typography, and how can you get away with this? And, you know, this is the good name of Monotype that's held up around the world for, you know, for great typefaces and perfection. How can you do this? And I got this really snotty letter back from the then design director, a man called Rennie Cafanti. And he basically put me in place and said, it's commercially acceptable. And I was just grateful for Fozzie that Fozzie could rescue the project for me. So after about 4 years, I kind of got the opportunity to come back to Manchester and to work at the Start of the Chase. And this one here is a significant landmark in my career, which was a relationship that I had with the Creative Circle. And I worked with the Creative Circle for just over 20 years. And I had an absolutely fabulous relationship with the Circle. And I worked on a number of big projects with them, including all their print and particularly their books. And, you know, it was a landmark because obviously I was this little designer in Manchester, all on my own, working with one of the most important award schemes, advertising award schemes in the UK and particularly in London. And there I was working for the Creative Circle. And it was a landmark for me. It was like 20 years of my life was devoted to working with the Creative Circle. And I have to be honest and say, guys, you don't really get those kind of relationships much these days. You know, sometimes, you know, our relationships with clients can be fleeting. You know, it might be one project, you know, and then you might not see them for 2 years and then they'll come back and stuff. So to work with the Creative Circle was, you know, a real landmark in my career. As a result of the work with the Circle, obviously I got to, you know, work with some brilliant illustrators and some great photographers. So here, you know, I worked with the illustrator David Hughes, and just in terms of the front cover, when I was working with Dave, I noticed that although he was an illustrator, that he actually really loved drawing letter forms as well. And at that point, I had no idea what I was going to do on the cover. I just, you know, I'd basically sold the Creative Circle David Hughes's work. David was ploughing away into all the illustrations, but I didn't know what I was going to do on the cover. So as soon as I saw David's drawing, you know, his actual letter forms, I then asked him to just to draw a load more, to keep drawing letter forms. And what I did was I took elements from lots of different bits of of David's typography and put the cover together. So, you know, David did the illustrations, and inadvertently he did the typography for the front cover as well. But you know, it just worked really well. The way there was, you know, the Creative Circle's logo at the time was that squiggle with a circle in it, and there was a perfect circle in the counter of the 5. So it just, you know, nice, sweet little idea of the counter making the circle in the Circle's logo. Okay. And here, this is another Creative Circle book, and this was in the year 2000. And what was unique about the Creative Circle in that year was they normally had 4 categories of awards. So they'd have a platinum, a gold, a silver, and a bronze. Okay. But in the year 2000, they didn't award any platinum. And in the year 2000, as with Mike Rigby's proto logo, there was 3 perfect circles in the year of 2000. So I really exploited that, and I had these rings made that were based on the proportions of the Creative Circle logo, and they were made in gold, silver, and bronze. But they were absolutely perfect. These, honestly, they were just amazing to look at. And I then commissioned this photographer called Richard Green, who at the time was getting quite a bit of coverage in Creative Review for work he'd done with a design group called C for GF Smith Paper. And Richard, basically, he was pretty much given a free hand on this. What he was asked to do was, and his brief really was, you know, these rings, these circles are absolutely perfect. Can you photograph them in an environment that contrasts with the perfection of the rings? And this is one of the images that he came back. But, you know, sometimes these ideas just fall into your lap, and, you know, you need to exploit them. And that is really some of my work for the Creative Circle. Kind of what I thought I'd show you now are kind of some landmark projects that kind of really took me away from the normal convention of print. Obviously, most of my work throughout my career has been print orientated, and these are some projects that kind of took me away from that. And by the very nature of them not being print based, you know, I would perhaps describe as kind of landmark projects. Okay. Okay. So in recent years, instead of going all digital, I've gone back hundreds of years, and I've ended up doing a lot of work in letterpress. And for me, it's such a joy. When I go into design studios and stuff, sometimes for me, they're like call centers where everyone's on their Mac and they're all zoned out with their headphones on in their own little world, crafting away, and that's great because that's the way it is now. But if you go to a letterpress studio, it's the complete opposite. Okay, it smells, it's oily, it's noisy. Okay, but it's a joy to work with. It is so tactile. It is so inviting to turn the prints over and rub your fingers over the back where you can feel the impression. Okay, it really is, stepping back hundreds of years to these old processes that have been, quite a landmark for me in recent years. And that obviously has included, prints, but also I've worked in greetings cards. This was a nice little greetings card for a company called Blush, a letterpress company called Blush. Just, a nice, sweet, simple idea. By turning the gravity on its side, it visually mirrors what gravity does. And then the craft of actually putting all the type together, making sure that everything visually aligns, making sure that the space between all the letters, is right, using the right dash in the date. Everything has been, really considered. Okay, so in 2016, I had the good fortune to be asked to work on the Shakespeare stamps with the Chase in Manchester. So for me, it was kind of a bit like coming home to be working with the Chase again. And I worked with Steve Royal. I was asked to submit a number of designs for this stamp. The brief wasn't anything other than it had to be typeset. We were given these sonnets from Shakespeare sonnets, and it had to be typeset. We weren't allowed to draw with the letters. We just had to do, quite simply, the brief was to do a really sweet piece of type. So for me, working on a 35mm square, having gone from working in, big broadsheet newspapers to 35mm squares, was quite a departure. And I suppose as a result of that, quite a landmark for me in terms of, what the areas and things that I've actually been commissioned to apply typography to. Okay, so that was the Shakespeare stamps. Okay, this is something that I never would have thought I'd ever end up doing, in a million years. It was a range of domestic tableware, and I was commissioned by a pottery company in Stoke. Believe it or not, they'd seen my book, and they wanted to produce a range of domestic tableware, so it included mugs, cups, saucers, plates, all sorts of domestic tableware, and each piece had an element of typographic good practice on, obviously all based on my book. So it always kind of tickled me, really, to think that someone could be sitting there having their Sunday roast, eating on my plate, and actually learn something about the origins of an ampersand or a lowercase g or what have you. It always kind of, made me smile. But the point is that this was a landmark because it's not something I ever expected to do. I was at, how many people are interested in type or would expect to work on a range of domestic tableware that could be found in John Lewis's or Selfridges or something, that people would go and buy and actually eat their dinner off. So it was kind of, a really kind of big landmark for me to work on this project. Okay, this is some work I did on the This Is the Place book, and why this is a landmark for me. It was because it was the first time I'd ever done something that was done for good, that was done to actually help people. So this book was produced by Glorious in Manchester, and what it was a book that was produced of Tony Walsh's ode to Manchester in the aftermath of the Manchester bomb. And the purpose of the book was to raise money for the victims' families and for the victims of the Manchester bomb. And I was one of the designers that was chosen to contribute to this. So obviously, you know, I wanted to tackle it from a typographic point of view. Now, in many ways, that is actually bad typography, because all the letters clash, they all touch, they all run into each other. But the point is it was to try and make that visual connection about coming together, how all the people of Manchester came together and stood strong in the aftermath of the bomb. And as I mentioned earlier, it was a key and a landmark project for me, because it was the first time I'd ever done anything that didn't have a commercial value. It was to do something for good, to do something for other people. So it was a particularly important landmark project for me. And I would add that I've actually seen this book now on Amazon, people on eBay asking £200 a copy for it, because it's so sought after. But it was a joy to work on. It was a joy to be asked to do this, and it was, you know, something for good. Right, I kind of guess you might know this. I know my friends at Preston are all very keen to push this, and I am very grateful for that. So this I suppose, next to the 20 years I worked with the Creative Circle, is possibly the biggest landmark in my career. How this all started for me was I was looking for work, and I went to see a design group in Manchester. And as I was walking out to the presentation, the guy who owned the agency said to me, "Jim, would you be interested in doing some talks on type?" And I said, "Well, yeah, of course. You know, if you're going to pay me, I'm happy to do that." And he went on to explain that he was a bit disenchanted with the level of typography, of typographic skill from the young designers. And he wanted me to, as part of 3 talks, give a talk about just simple everyday things that you could do to your typography that would improve the standard of your typography. So I gave this talk, and I produced this talk and delivered it, and it just sat on my desktop for months. And I'm sure some of you might know that I teach part-time at Staffordshire University. I started back there in the September, and I went to see the awards manager, a lovely lady called Barbara Ridley, and I said, "Look, Barbara, over the summer I've been giving these talks on typography, and it really wouldn't take much for me to prepare the files for print. You know, would you fancy producing this little booklet for the students?" And fortunately for me, the university found the money and produced the booklet, and Creative Review got hold of it. And I knew nothing about this, and I came in one morning and opened my university email, and my inbox was just a mass of emails from all over the world asking for a copy of the booklet. And it really really surprised me because I knew nothing about this. But there was two in all of those emails. There was two emails that, for me, that were particularly pertinent. Which was one from from a publisher in New York called Abrams, who had seen the article in Creative Review and were interested in talking to me about developing it into a book. The other one was from the design studio of Apple in California, and they were asking for copies of the booklet also for some of their designers in their design studio. So two, massively important emails. As Dan got an email from Jessica Walsh, because of this, I was getting emails from New York, from publishers in New York, and from Apple in California, and it really took me aback what happened. And my wife had been saying to me, for quite some years, that I should do a book, write a book about typography, because it's kind of all I talk about, much to my wife's frustration. And I then entered into a conversation with Abrams and spoke on a number of occasions to their commissioning editor. And they unfortunately decided not to go ahead with it. But what it did do, it gave me the confidence to think, well, actually, maybe there really is something in this. Maybe I should try and get it published. So I put some visuals together and I sent it off to, I think, in total 5 publishers. And I had a very clear, it was very clear in my mind how I wanted this to look. So I wanted this notebook feel. I wanted it for people to feel comfortable with it, for it to be like a notebook, like something you'd keep on your desk or in your drawer, something that you could just feel confident you could dip in and out of. It wouldn't be something that you'd put on a shelf somewhere and just forget about. And for me, one of the things that's been a joy is going into studios, and I see it on people's desks where people just use it as a visual reference. And that's very much what it does. One of the publishers that I spoke to, they wanted to make it a handbook for InDesign. And, I had this very clear vision of how I wanted my book to look, how I wanted it to work, what the proposition was, that this is what the computer gives you, this is what you need to make the type look like. However whatever skills you have, whatever software you use, this is kind of what you kind of need to try and do to the typography. And I had a conversation with other publishers and they said, oh, yeah, we really like your book, Jim. We like the concept, this about making type simple to understand. And yeah, we really like it, but we only want you to write a chapter for another book that we're doing on typography. So I actually made the decision to pull out of conversations with these people. But I did, very fortunately, I sent my proposals to Merrill, who I knew had actually done a book on typography. And I thought, well, I've got nothing to lose. I'll send it to them. And they offered me a deal, and they offered it to me exactly as I wanted it. I wasn't going to change. I had a very clear vision, as I say, about how I wanted my book to look and how it should work. And the main creative director, Merrill, she saw it and got behind it. It was a lovely lady called Nicola Bailey. And Nicola went to one of the meetings and she stood up and she spoke for the book. And they did come back to me and said, look, Jim, yeah, we're happy. We're going to give you everything you want. It's going to be exactly as you want. will you sign this contract? And I signed the contract, and here it is out on the shelves, and hopefully helping people to make better typography. So it was a key landmark in my career. Okay, so I'm just going to show you a couple of the spreads. So obviously, you know, we all work on computers today, but where does that terminology come from? Where does point size come from? Where does leading come from? Where does kerning come from? All that terminology emanates from this old process of metal type. And this is a good kind of image where you can see metal type and how it works, whereby the actual printing image, the actual letter forms are actually in relief. And even today, in print today, even if you print in litho, they still refer to it as an impression. And that, again, is terminology and jargon that comes from metal type. Okay. So I'm just going to show you some of the spreads. So these are, this spread is about using the correct apostrophes and quotation marks. Quite often the top marks on the left, they originate from a typewriter, which was in our typewriter is a universal mark. It would work both as an apostrophe, as a single quote, as feet and inch marks. But I think for the most part in print, it's just basic bad typography. Okay. If you set a comma, you will always get 99.9% of the time. If you set a comma, you will get a comma, and that comma will tell you exactly and would be a good visual reference to actually what the quote marks and what the apostrophes and single quotes should actually look like. The other thing to remember is if you go back to your school days and you think about when you were learning to read, and perhaps your school teacher might say to you, yeah, well, we're going to do quotation marks today, and we want you to think of them as 66 and 99. And that, I would suggest to you that still holds true, that if you just think of those very simple reminders, they will help you, you know, create better typography. Okay, so this is a spread where I'm really talking about, well, this was actually a couple of spreads where I'm talking about the use of ligatures. So for the most part, and the most common ligatures you might use on a day-to-day basis might be an FI and an FL. The reason why we use these marks is, particularly with an FI and an FL, is to avoid clash. So clash is when parts of letters touch. So here you can see the I dot actually smacking into the terminal of the F. Okay. As a general rule, that's not good typography. Always use an FI ligature. So you might say to me, well, where can I find a FI and FL ligatures? Well, obviously it depends what program you're using to do your typography. But if you go to type and you find glyphs, if you click on glyphs, what comes up is what we call a character set. So a character set is every letter, upper and lowercase, every numeral, every figure, every punctuation mark, every mark that's available for that typeface. And you will find your FI and FL ligatures within your character set. Okay. So here I'm talking about the correct use of ampersands, and there is actually a correct way to use them. This also kind of follows on from the ligature thing. I don't know if anyone's aware, but the origins of an ampersand are as a ligature of E and T, because et is Latin for and is one of the most common words that we use in Latin and English. So that's why the ampersand was developed. But you can see it particularly on the left-hand page. If you look at the big ampersand there, you can clearly see the E and the T which makes up the ampersand. But there are, as I say, there are particularly within text, there are particular times that you should and shouldn't use ampersands. Okay, so here we just have the 3 rules. So you have a hyphen, an N dash, and an M dash, and they all do different things. The easiest way to use as a guide to make sure that you're using the correct dashes is if you want to use an N dash, if you compare it against a lowercase n. If you want an M dash, if you compare it against a capital M. Okay, so it's just some, kind of really simple tips there that will just help you, create, better typography. Okay, so just to kind of illustrate to you why the Type Matters was such a landmark for me. It wasn't just seeing my work, published out there on the bookshelves. My wife and I started this thing where wherever my wife and I were away on holiday or we were visiting friends, and if there was a bookshop, we'd go in and we'd see if we could find my book on the shelves, and she'd take a picture of me with it, and we've got this little collection of images taken in lots of different Waterstones around the country. But principally what it did do for me was it opened up a lot of public speaking for me, going around the country talking about type. So I went to lots of other universities to speak, and I spoke at industry events to talk about typography, because type is the glue that holds everything together. Type, if you have no money to spend on image or anything or expensive print or what have you, beautiful typography, type with an idea in it, is a real opportunity. Type presents opportunity not just for the craft, for the execution, but also for ideas, to embed ideas in letter forms. The book obviously also won a number of awards. And just to continue the thing about the emails I got when the book was published, I honestly, again, I got emails from all over the world, from professors in the States to students in India who contacted me to thank me for the book. But what was really lovely, and I have mentioned this to Andy, and I did actually send Andy a picture of myself with his book when I first saw it in a shop, that people would send me photographs of themselves actually with the books. So the guy here on the left was from Northern Ireland. The guy on the right was a student at a design college in India. And, people would either send me photographs of themselves with it, or they'd send photographs of the book sitting on a bookshelf. So, and that all started with a student at the Royal College who sent me a picture of the book in their type section at the Royal College. So it's been such a joy to do, and such, a landmark for me, as really, really trying to get out there, the importance of typography, that, type is the glue that, holds much of what we do together. You need to be competent with type. So that's kind of me coming to a close here. I do have one further animation, which is an animation that I was sent by a student in New York. This was an animation done by a student in one of the big art schools. I think it was Parsons in New York. And his brief was to pick a book or some subject that inspired him as a creative. And he actually chose my book to do a short video on. So I'm going to come out of this now and turn to my friend Ted, who's going to actually show you the video.
We're ready.
Okay. So. Okay, guys, I hope I've spoke for long enough. But that's pretty much me done now.
Superb.
That is my career in a nutshell, as a series of landmark projects that I've worked on, you know, for whatever reason. So thank you very much for listening, and you know, thanks for having me, guys.
Ted, can you put that link on? That
There you go.
image link on the chat? The YouTube link.
Yeah, I've got them all.
Fantastic.
Cheers, Pete.
Questions?
So yeah, any questions, guys?
Questions for Jim or for Dan? Sean.
Yeah, thanks, Jim and Dan. Those two fantastic, really thought-provoking presentations. Great, really enjoyed them. Just a question for Dan, really. I was interested in that photograph, the photographs you took in your dad's studio. Firstly, with him in the studio and all the stuff, and then years later, when you put the stuff into boxes and sorted it out. What happened to all that work? I mean, did you? Is it on display anywhere, or you know, is it available to see, or has it been curated in any way?
We did have an exhibition. It was actually this time last year in Bolton, and it was called Men of Letters.
Oh, right.
So it was a celebration of the lives and the work of my dad, but then also a chap called Phil Grimshaw, who I don't know if you're familiar with, but so he was actually a student of my dad's at Bolton when my dad used to teach there, and then years later they became friends. But Phil tragically died, I think, when he was about 48. So, you know, we always wanted to try and do something to share Phil's work. And then 10 years later, my dad passed away, and we were just faced with these mountains of work. So, I mean, yeah, it took, well, the best part of a decade to actually get around to organizing and categorizing the work in some way so that we could actually share the work in the exhibition. So, and I was really proud of that, but I would still like to try and put something out there that's got a bit more permanence than that. I mean, I'd love to do another exhibition. There was talk after the one in Bolton that maybe we'd go to Manchester, then maybe we go to London. I actually had an invite from somebody in Mexico saying, can you come over and do the exhibition, which was crazy. But yeah, I would really like to do something that's got a bit more permanence to it. I did start an Instagram account with my dad's work. I've started sharing some work there. I've not posted anything for a little while, just for being busy and other reasons, but I hope to try and continue to share the work there. But I think the ultimate dream is to do a book, to get a book out there. So yeah, hopefully that's something we can do in the not too distant future. But it's like anything, all these things, they require time and, you know, an effort. But at the moment, the work, the picture that you saw, that you mentioned with the boxes, it's a lot of that is still exactly where it is in my mum's, or what was my dad's old extension, studio, the extension on the house, which is now a sort of second living room come storage facility with all my dad's work. But yeah, I really want to try and do something more permanent, like you're saying.
Yeah, thanks for that. What I'd also like to say was both of your presentations, the kind of founding of all your work in craft skills, and the importance of learning you know, craft skills and the language of type so important. And I was really pleased to see that you'd made that connection clear. So thanks very much. Great presentations.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. So, any other questions?
Rachel, I think there's one in, Andy, there's one in the chat somewhere.
Yeah.
Can you see it? I can't see it.
There's a few in the chat, actually. From Carolus, Jim, what would you suggest to do if someone is stuck choosing between lots and lots of different serif fonts, seeing how a lot of these fonts look very similar to the untrained eye? Good question.
Yeah, I think I read the other day that there's somewhere like something close to 120,000 typefaces that are commercially available at the moment. I think it goes, you know, you need to go back to your research. What does your research tell you? You know, if your research tells you, for example, that it's an old style, or is it transitional, then, you know, choose the most appropriate typeface for that. It all really comes down to a feeling a lot of the time. The more experienced you get, the more it just comes down to a feeling. You just know that that's the right typeface. I mean, for example, in my book, I kind of touch on this, and I give an example of a children's entertainer and a financial advisor. And by switching the typefaces around, one looks right for the children's entertainer and one looks right for the financial advisor. So the one that looks right for the financial advisor makes the clown look very boring, but the one that's right for the clown makes the financial advisor look totally untrustworthy. You wouldn't trust him with a penny of your cash. So it's kind of, you know, you just, with time and experience, and the more you work on projects, you'll build up an empathy and an understanding to know what the right typeface is to use on a project. So say, for example, you know, the one I showed you about the This Is the Place book. I chose that typeface specifically because it was bold, it was strong, you know, it was a big slab serif, you know, it had a kind of a visual strength to it. And that's why I chose Clarendon, because I wanted that to come across, that visual connection with the people of Manchester being strong and how they came together, you know, to pull through this and stuff. So yeah, typeface choice is very important. Absolutely. But it will, if you're finding it hard now, honestly, it will get easier once you're exposed, you know, to more projects and stuff. The more you work on, you'll develop, you know, a skill and an ability to, you know, choose the right face.
Can I just say something at this point in time, Jim? Type is a journey, isn't it? And it takes time. I think one of the places to start is just to know your basics, isn't it? You know, you know, your slab serif, sans. What is a sans serif? What serif? And the classics. Get familiar with the classics, like you would with your music, with your classic albums. You know, the ones that have stood the test of time. That's a good place to start, and then you can build upon that. Without that, you will be a little bit all at sea, won't you?
Yeah, you know, and I think, you know, I've known designers in the past, Andy, that will only use one of 6 typefaces. You know, they have a very limited palette of typefaces to choose from. But you know, that's the way they choose to work. You know, I personally don't have that mindset. When I start a project and I'm looking at choosing a typeface, I always, as Dan said in his own presentation, keep an open mind. Yeah. And as the project progresses, you know, you'll get to feel what the right typeface is.
I mean, if you treat it as shape, like Dan was saying, it's what shapes fit. Do you know what I mean? What it's like shape, isn't it? You said about bold faces or a bit of elegance about it, but you do focus.
Yeah, I mean, exactly, Andy. And you know, when it comes to like spacing between letters and stuff, I mentioned to you that my first boss was this lady called Maggie Lewis. And one of the first things she taught me about letter spacing was that quite often, if you turn the type upside down, you don't see letters, all you see is spaces.
Yeah.
So it's a useful, little tip when you're trying to, letter space type visually, is to turn it the other way, and you don't recognize letters, you just, recognize spaces. So
Andy Mayers showed me that.
Oh, did he? Yeah. Yeah, it's a really simple little tip, just like the one about ensuring you've got the right apostrophes and quotation marks. If you compare it to a comma, if you set a comma, you will always get a comma, and that that's a really useful guide to ensure that you've got the right marks.
Yeah.
And guys, it does matter. Detail matters.
Absolutely.
And when you go to these groups that that really top-notch groups, they're gonna kind of look for that detail, that they want to know that you care, so
my dad,
sorry, on down. Sorry,
I was going to say, my dad used to say, pay attention to the details and the rest will fall into place. That was just like a little phrase that I'd hear him saying it quite often. But if you think about it, any amazing piece of design is just a big collection of well-made small details that are put together. So if you can get all of those right, the overall piece is going to sing. Yeah, and it's my dad. I remember my dad doing that as well with a piece of lettering. Somebody'd hand something to him and say, "What do you think of this?" And he'd hold it at arm's length and turn it upside down, just to review it. And like you say, Jim, just looking at the shapes, not the letter forms, but just shapes. Are those shapes equal in weight? Are they equally spaced? Do they feel right as a set together? All these little details that he was looking at. But it's definitely a good tip.
Yeah.
There's a good question here about type and trend, which is interesting. So, would you say that fonts can be trendy, and how do these trends and fashions sort of develop over time? I mean, I can just start the conversation off with that because, again, fashion, fonts come in and out of fashion, don't they? And somebody starts wearing a certain kind of trouser, and somebody follows. And I've noticed that in design, people can start using a font that might not have been used, maybe from the 70s, and it gets high profile on a job, and it gets a lot of kind of coverage. And then, people feed off that and go, oh, I'll try that like this. And it's very similar to fashion. It's very difficult to work out where it starts, but sometimes you can start with a really high profile job, and then it spreads from there, and then it can go out of fashion. So they can come in and out, can't they? But some of the classics will never go out of. You know what I mean?
No, yeah, I think so, Andy, and I think some of these typefaces, in a way, their popularity can be short-lived, but the classics always stand the test of time. I mean, I noticed someone like Pete Saville, who was like at the forefront of fashion, still tends to use classic typefaces in some way, and of all that ilk of famous Manchester factory records designers, for me, Saville has that more timeless quality.
Yeah, I think there's an argument for not getting sucked into the trends as well.
Yeah.
I just grabbed this book off my shelf called Zag. It's basically saying, when the others zig, you should zag. So, because you want to stand out ultimately.
Yeah.
So if you're just doing the same thing as everybody else and following the trends, then you're just going to blend in with everybody else.
Yeah.
So there's that argument. I mean, it depends on the target audience of the project that you're doing and who you're aiming at. If you're wanting to go for an audience that is particularly attracted to a certain trend, then yeah, of course you do something in line with that. But on the other hand, if you're wanting to stand out, then ignore the trends and do your own thing.
Sometimes it could be what's right for the job. So trends aside,
Definitely. Yeah.
it's the magician. Banker, lawyer, what typeface is right for this client at this point in time, or the feel for it. So
yes, it sets tone, Andy. It sets tone straight from the outset. What typeface you use. It's as much as an important design decision as maybe what color you might use.
Yeah.
It's really important.
Yeah, it depends on the application as well. So, if you're creating something that's going to be seen on a website or an app at a really small size, then you probably not go for a serif, because it's quite hard to read down at those small sizes. So you'd want something that was fairly open, that was maybe a sans serif. It's easy to read and discern the characters. So there's factors like that should play into the decision making when you're choosing typefaces.
I think also something with a large X height, Dan.
Yes.
Particularly on screen, you need something, with a largish X height.
Yeah.
If you took like Garamond, a lovely old style Garamond, it might not be as legible as something like a geometric sans or something.
I think just to follow on from that as well, we often find that we'll be looking at typefaces which are really quite cheap and badly drawn, and it's recognizing the value of the classic faces and not shying away from them, and just because it's free to download doesn't mean that it's going to be any good. So quite a lot of the time there is this kind of tendency to use quite ugly fonts, whereas actually just going back to just some of the classic fonts will make the work look ultimately better as well.
Yeah. I think that's so right, John, honestly.
Jim, Dan, there's another question here in the chat. Underneath your photo, Jim, can you see it? Do you have a personal style of lettering font? How has this changed with your experience during your career?
Is that like a favorite typeface? Is that the question, or a favorite style?
It's under Jim's photo in the chat. Can you see it? 1516.
Can't see that.
I think it is a bit like, what is your favourite typeface kind of question, I think.
Sorry, I didn't really speak before because my Wi-Fi is really bad.
Oh,
yeah, that's what I meant.
Go for it.
Personal style of lettering or font. I do mean like typeface. I saw earlier that that Dan uses a really curvy, really, don't know what's the word.
Script?
Yeah, I saw you use that kind of font. Is that your personal style? And has that changed over time?
It probably wasn't a font. It was, so it would be drawn from scratch. So, and with regard to style, the first thing I do when deciding on a style is I'll look at the brief and what does this particular job require. So it won't be a case of just choosing a random style because I like that and I want to work on it. It has to have some relevance to that job and what the brief is trying to do. So yeah, so to be honest, I don't really have favorites of anything because I'm changing my mind all the time.
Oh, I thought because I know that you enjoy it as a hobby. I thought, well, it is it's more than a hobby, obviously, but I mean, because you do it for fun as well. I thought that you might have a personal favorite.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I mean, yes, there are certain styles that I really enjoy working with for sure. So I do enjoy working with scripts. I find it really challenging to work with scripts, to try and find the right balance between the letter forms and then how the swashes, for instance, might work with that and how they might be expressive depending on what the word says. If I was working on something recently and it just says make waves. So I was trying to do something expressive with the swashes that sort of replicated the shapes of waves. So yeah, I mean, there's so many possibilities, but yeah, I don't really have favorites, but I do like scripts. I do like the black letter style. I find that fascinating as well because there's so many other sort of subgenres of black letter, Fracture, and there's many others. And I find the sort of history of where they came from and why the shapes are the way they are. I find that really interesting. So that's something I enjoy working with as well. But yeah, I mean, I always try and do something that is relevant to any brief that comes in. That's really important. But yeah, of course, we all have, you know, the ones that we prefer working with from time to time. So I'd say scripts and black letter I find quite appealing. They always catch my attention. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that answers my question. Thank you.
Okay.
There's a couple more questions in the question bar. Will, you've got a question, I believe.
Yeah. Fantastic talks from both of you. I have a question for Dan. How do you push through when you're putting creative block?
Well, I think I said in the talk that if I'm stuck with something, if the time on the project allows, I will leave it alone for a little while. You know, because you can be working on something for hours at a time and you're constantly staring at it and you get a bit blind to what's going on. So if you can put that to one side, come back to it a few hours later or a day later or a week later, and then you see it with fresh eyes, and suddenly you'll see something that you didn't see before, and you're able to make the adjustments to correct those things. So definitely time away from a project is really a good idea. Yeah.
Thank you.
I would imagine, especially with the level of focus you're putting into something as well, as you say.
Yeah, start on paper first.
I know. I think that's important. I mean, one of the things was lovely to see, Dan, was the drawing, obviously, and you know, and it goes without saying, you know, the drawing aspect of what you do is absolutely fundamental. And anybody who wants to, and Claire Parker touched upon it.
Yeah.
And we were brought up that way as well, drawing and drawing and drawing the type, drawing over and over again, and that's the best way. You know, it's the only way, really.
Yes, iterate, keep drawing and redrawing. Yeah, and I think I would say, you know, we talked a lot about drawing type, but I think as a designer, if you can, you know, I'd just say learn to draw in general. You know, some of the best designers that I know, I mean, Milton Glaser comes to mind straight away. I mean, he's a brilliant draftsman. He can draw, and I think if you can draw and you understand shapes and form, you're able to distill that down into making, you know, what might start out as complex shapes become simple shapes that you could use in a symbol or a logo. And so I just think if you can learn to draw, it'll really help you as a designer.
Okay, thank you.
And there's kind of tracing and copying and refining, isn't it? You know.
Yeah.
I think that's important because I mean, life drawing is one of the most difficult things. I think sometimes when people say, "Oh, I can't draw," I mean, it's kind of like well, it's one of those things that's no. We'll just start practicing. I mean, nobody's asking you to draw life drawing, which is really difficult.
Yeah, I think also as well with lettering and type, I'd say it's okay to copy to learn. You know, I don't mean copy and then pass off that as your own work. I don't mean that at all. But I mean, in your own space, if you're interested in script works, for example, and this is something my dad used to do because his photocopier was broke or something, he would just like literally trace over Tony Despigna's work and then he'd put it in his file just as a reference. You know, he'd never pass it off as his own work, but he'd make that copy so that he could learn something himself by going through that process, and he'd see how the marks had been drawn. And you know, when you focus in like that, you'll pick things up. So it's definitely okay to copy to learn, but not to copy to pass it off as your own work.
Do you think you could forge a tenner?
No.
Damn.
Yeah.
I know, Andy, at 20.
Yeah, make it worth your while.
Let's be ambitious about this. At 20.
I was just going to say quickly, Dan, I don't know if you know this, but Claire Parker on Monday presented KY Jelly. Nice little serendipity that it's come full circle to you doing the type on it.
Yeah.
All right. I didn't know. To be honest, I've been really busy, so I've not had chance.
No, it's just
Really
nice.
I'm really dying to. I'm going to spend some time this weekend looking at some of them. What was the name again? Claire
Parker.
Yeah, she went through the brand, didn't she? And
yeah,
it's on her presentation.
Just like there's a Venn diagram of the speakers here, and there's loads of little crossovers.
No, that's really interesting. I'm gonna look for that, definitely.
So you were commissioned by Designbridge to do that, yeah, obviously.
That's right.
Yeah.
So at first they got in touch and they asked me to do just one piece. I think it was the piece Give Me Goosebumps, and they sort of told me the kind of idea where they wanted the type to sort of almost like tickle itself or interact with itself in some way. So, and they'd had like a very rough kind of like serif sketch that they sent me of, something like this. It was only a couple of characters. So I went away and took that and created this piece, Give Me Goosebumps. I sent that back to them, and then they approved that, and then they came back to me later with the whole rest of the series. And what was in my talk and what I've actually seen that's gone live so far is only a handful of actually what we did with the project. There was actually there must have been like 20 odd, maybe 30 packs. And then I also worked on the French Canadian language versions for Canada.
Interesting.
I've not seen those yet. I don't know if they've been launched or they're due to get launched. Sometimes you'll work on a project and it'll be a year and a half or 2 years later until it actually sees the light of day. By which point you've often forgot about it,
yeah.
And then you see it, and you're like, oh yeah, that's amazing, I forgot. But
Nick's got a question.
Oh yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. This is for both of you actually. I just wanted to know, so when you're doing a project that involves obviously like your book or just a large piece of different typography, you were saying that people tend to sort of stick with their favorites and don't be brave, but obviously I think there's like a consistency with using like certain ones that people are sort of comfortable with. How do you decide to go for a different one and think, this one's definitely going to work? And also, when you're doing like a piece of script or something like that, how do you know when you're done? Because you said that you spent like, hours doing it. When's it ready?
That's a good question.
Sorry, long question.
Yeah, I think, like I say, often with a lot of projects, they can get carried away, or I can get carried away, and they'll end up being really complicated. And if I'm not sure, like I was saying, I'll leave it alone. So I often end up starting out simple, getting really complicated, leaving it alone, coming back to it and going, that's too complicated, and then seeing what I can do to remove things and make it simple. And it's funny how often that happens. And I don't know, I guess it's a feeling and it's down to experience. You just know when the balance feels right. There's all kinds of different details that you can look at that will tell you that something's working or not. And it could be down to things like legibility, or the overall shape or the composition of something might not feel quite right. And sometimes it's not always that obvious immediately, but like I say, if you leave it alone for a while, come back to it, and then you can make that judgment.
I think also you have to kind of, if you work in publishing, you have to think about the end user.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is if you're dealing with large volumes of text, whether it be a book or a magazine, as the designer, one of the key things is readability. Okay.
Yeah.
And readability does differ from legibility. Readability is quite simply how comfortable something is to read. So if you've got a lot of text, can I sit there for hours and read that comfortably? And that's not just the typeface, it's also the way you set the type that all contributes to that. How many is there enough words to the measure? Is there too many words to the measure? Is the leading too tight, etc. So there's a number of things that particularly with working with large volumes of text that you do have to consider.
Okay, and just like sort of, sorry, am I all right to ask another part of the question?
Yeah, of course.
So just with that, so how would you sort of then have the confidence to go and say, okay, in this particular point, I'm not going to go and use like a Gotham, or I'm not going to go and use like a Bodoni or whatever. I'm going to go and be brave and sort of go and take this one because everybody else is doing that. I'm going to go and do this, Does that
Can I tell you a funny story? I worked on a book, right? It was a print job for the Circle many years ago, and it was just when digital type was starting to come in. So it wasn't the Mac or anything. It was a typesetting system called Scan Graphic, and it was really the first digital type. And I set this book in Bodoni. Now you'll know Bodoni has these hairline serifs. There's a real distinction between thick and thin strokes. And when I got the bromides back, it looked okay to the eye. It looked okay. But when you got it under a glass, the serifs were grey. Okay, so this was, as I say, this was all pre-digital, and so obviously you would produce a piece of mechanical artwork, then they'd have to take a negative to make the plates and stuff. Well, what happened was when they took the negs of the artwork, the serifs disappeared. So we had to print this thing in Bodoni with no serifs because they disappeared because it was the start of digital type. No, I tell you honestly, I mean, when digital type started, it was pretty ropey, I promise you. And I mentioned, earlier about having to get Dan's dad to help me with this, monotype Baskerville. It was, but I mean, it is sorted now, guys. I'm just, this was all in the very early days, and obviously, things have got better since then. But yeah, it's still to this day, I just think, how did I get away with it?
You just say it's just trial and error.
Yeah, a book in Bodoni with no serifs.
Oh no.
Yeah.
But I think it comes down to, well, we've said this already, but I think it comes down to the brief as well, or what is it that you're trying to do with the piece of design or the type that you're using. And if sometimes Gotham isn't right for and it might just be for the fact, like you said, that everybody else is using it. So what else is out there that feels right for your project? But try and have some kind of justification to it. And it might be that, like Jim said earlier, if you can get an understanding of the sort of basic history of like type styles and where they've all derived from, it will make it easier for you to make a decision as to what is relevant in a certain situation. And there's some great books on the history of type and where it's come from, and the things like type classifications, which don't really get talked about a great deal, but they're actually really important as to why certain faces look the way that they do.
Well, Dan mentioned earlier about this thing of sub classifications. So you might think that all sans serifs are the same, but they're not. There's at least 3 sub classifications:
humanist,
sans serif, humanist, geometric, and Gothic. So when you say a sans serif, they're all. And yeah.
Sorry, Jim, to interrupt there.
No, sorry, Dan. Yeah, but yeah,
go on.
Yeah, there's lots of different, huge differences in classification of typeface.
Have you come across? You will have done, obviously. Eric Speaker and Stop Stealing Sheep.
Yeah,
I haven't read it. I've actually, if Dan's going to show, one of the first books that inspired me was this Eric Speakerman's Rhyme and Reason, and it's a typographical novel. and it was done. It was done as a promotional piece for Berthold, and Berthold was at the time. You know, this is photo setting days. Berthold was the creme de la creme. That glass grid, that font that I showed you at the beginning, that was Berthold. But the quality was just, you know, magnificent.
German.
Yeah. I was very lucky, Andy. You know, in the first few years, actually, when I was started off with Maggie. Maggie arranged for me to go to Berlin to meet Eric Spiekermann and to do a tour of typesetting companies in Berlin. And honestly, it was really totally different. It really was. Typically, a typesetter in Germany was a language graduate. So, you know, they couldn't only just set their own languages. You know, they could set, you know, Russian, Spanish or English or what have you. And I remember they showed me a book that they were working on again, and it was something like 120 page book, this 120 page book, and it was just solid text. And in that, when they completed that, there were 12 revisions, 12 amends in 120 pages, and only six of those 12 were actually mistakes made by the typesetter. Absolutely incredible.
I think it's important to point out that Germany is sort of in Europe as a birthplace, obviously, of movable type, and Gutenberg,
yeah.
Precision, the German.
That's right.
But
it all started with black letters. The need obviously started in Germany. So the first like commercial typefaces, if you could want to say, would be a black letter, because Dan's right. It was about reproducing handwriting.
Yeah.
And, you know, black letter was the hand of the German people. That's how they wrote, you know, in black letter.
The history of type is actually fascinating, and I've just pulled this book off my shelf. It's called Letter Forms, and it says typeface design from past to future, but it's got a brilliant section on the history of type and where it all comes from, and you know the changes that have happened over time. You know, like you just mentioned, Jim, with black letter, but then how was it Charlemagne who, you know, he wanted to sort of reproduce all the sort of works of you know, a lot of stuff that the Romans had come up with, and he had all these monks redrawing all the known works of science and all this kind of stuff, but they couldn't write fast enough with black letter, so the type actually evolved into something called, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, but I think it was Carolean. So it's like a Carolean script, you know, and at this point, upper and lowercase didn't exist. It's just like one set of letters, and the evolution of how things changes because of the necessity for the monks to write a lot. They had to write quicker, and then lowercase or what they call minuscules sort of evolved out of that. So it's fascinating, you know. And then years and years later, I think in 1816, there was nothing but serif typefaces, and then Caslon came along. And he had this like radical idea of making a typeface without serifs, and everybody like protested at it, and they thought it was horrific, and they were calling it things like grotesque. Oh, it's horrible! It looks so ugly, and that's where you get the term grotesques from. No. So it's fascinating. It's really fascinating, and get a book like this and have a little read, because it's, you know, you think, oh, history just all dull and boring, but absolutely not.
It's absolutely true. You know, the very first alphabets were all capitals. They didn't have lowercase, and it was quite often, even in type, it's commercial pressure that drives things. So the need, you know, to write quickly, you know, led to like the development of lowercase, because it was, I suppose, in a way, it was a form of shorthand.
Yeah.
You know, and it was because they couldn't do it quick enough.
Yeah. Yeah.
So even with letter forms, it's driven by money.
well, the need to write in the first place, you know, like, and it talks about it in here back in I think it was in Mesopotamia somewhere, you know, on the Mediterranean, and the need to, because of trade, they had to document things. They had to document the sales. So they'd have these little tablets, and they'd make marks in clay at first, and it was just a documentation of trade. So what have they sold, and all these kind of things. And at the time, it was all, you know, a bit like hieroglyphics. It was all symbols, and then over time that evolved. But it all started out because of the need to trade. So it's it's fascinating.
Any last questions, Andy?
There's one from Kalisha.
It's not a question, but I just wanted to say that I was fortunate enough to go see the Men of Letters exhibition in Bolton. It was truly incredible. I got to take my parents, who at the time were still getting used to the idea of me studying art. And honestly, the work mesmerized me and my dad. He loved it as well. And I still have the pictures that I took from it, and I used it in my what would have been my end of year project for college before COVID took over. And once again, I just want to say it was incredible. And if there was ever going to be another exhibition, maybe in Manchester, I would definitely go, and I'd recommend it to others as well. But I just wanted to say it was fantastic.
Oh, thank you so much. That really means a lot. It's great to hear that. And yeah, fantastic. I'm glad you made it along. And you know, that's what we all hope, that by doing these things we can inspire other people to get involved and to, you know, make their own marks, which is what we've been talking about today. So yeah, that's fantastic. Thanks for sharing that. I appreciate it.
That might be a good place to end. Do you think? Or is there any more? Oh, and the dog.
It was funny yesterday with Rosie. The dog kept putting a star in performance.
Well, thank you very much, guys.
Pleasure, Andy.
Everybody.
Yeah,
thanks, Jim. Thanks, Dan. Wonderful.
That was brilliant. Really appreciated. I think another round of applause for both guys, I think.
Tomorrow is Griff from Hastings, and Gary and Keith and JP.